Is it possible that this photo unknowingly gave away top secret information about one of the greatest discoveries in mountaineering? And it cracked wide open the biggest mystery on Mount Everest. And I just spoke with a man who may be the perfect person to determine exactly where the remains of Sandy Irvine are on the Central Rongbuk Glacier on Mount Everest because of this very photo. On June 8th, 1924, George Mallory and Sandy Irvine vanished high along the northeast ridge of Mount Everest, and for a century it has been debated whether they made it to the summit before perishing nearly 30 years before Hillary and Tenzing successfully climbed the mountain. In 1999, I was part of the team that discovered the remains of George Mallory, but Sandy, he remained lost until now. In 2024, a National Geographic team made world news when they announced the discovery of a boot, sock, and partial human remains on the Central Rongbuk Glacier directly below the north face of Mount Everest, essentially below where the remains of Mallory had been found in 1999. The sock bore the label A.C. Irvine, and it was unmistakable, but National Geographic gave us no GPS coordinates and kept understandably very mum about the precise location of that boot. So therein, I released a video shortly after that, which has become the most viewed long-form video on Everest mystery, What Nat Geo Won't Tell You About Sandy's Boot. And if you haven't seen that video yet, I urge you to watch that right after this video. This boot wasn't just a random artifact, it was a century-old clue, a golden nugget, finally emerging from the secrets of Mount Everest. From that moment on, several of my friends in the community of those interested in solving the mystery of Mallory and Irvine began to communicate on email and in Zoom phone calls. Some of these people were on the mountain in 1999, and some had been writing about it and studying it. And we began tossing around some ideas about not only where the boot was, but what would we do if we were in charge of a return expedition to complete that search for the remains of Sandy Irvine. It would require a team of researchers and professionals, a pathologist, a glaciologist, and also the proper technology to go and do a vast search of the glacier. And recently, I spoke with Bob Edwards. He is the author of Mallory, Irvine, and Everest, The Last Step But One. Bob is one of the few people really fully qualified to reverse engineer exactly where that boot is or was on the Central Rongbuk Glacier when that team from National Geographic discovered it. Firstly, Bob is a mathematician. He's also a writer. His analysis goes well beyond educated guesswork. He used data from NASA's It's Live project, which tracks glacial velocity over time, satellite imagery, overlays, and geolocation tools like Peak Finder and Peak Visor. And in this photo in particular, several of us noted something very peculiar about Jimmy Chin crouching near the boot. And I'm sure when they published this photograph, they had no idea what they were offering us along the way. It became Bob Edwards' Rosetta Stone. Check out the reflections in Jimmy's sunglasses. Analyzed against mountain silhouettes, it suggests a precise location, a spot somewhere in the Central Rongbuk Glacier. Bob Edwards used that point and did an extensive study over the course of days and weeks to try to determine exactly where it was based on the outline of the mountains in the background of the reflection of Jimmy Chin's teammates standing looking back at him as this photograph is being taken. Imagine the Central Rongbuk Glacier as a slow-moving conveyor belt. It may have carried Sandy Irvine's remains thousands of feet or meters from where he originally fell. In my interview with Bob, the math holds up and the story gets even more interesting. I'm going to bring you tidbits of that information in that interview with Bob Edwards, but also put together a team with the technology to go back and look for the rest of the remains and other artifacts from 1924. I want to take a breath for just a minute and tell you about Cook Unity, the sponsor of today's video. I love to cook, but only when I have the time to do so. Cook Unity provides high quality meals, and it's actually cheaper than going to the grocery store and shopping. That's where Cook Unity comes in. Cook Unity delivers freshly prepared restaurant quality meals, and it comes right to my door made by top chefs from around the country. Like this week, I had Indian butter shrimp curry by Chef Meena Srinivas, and roasted salmon with Dijon honey sauce by Chef Vanessa Kantav. Absolutely amazing, and it looks fantastic right out of the package. Restaurant quality food in my own kitchen, no cooking, no cleanup, from the oven right to the dinner table. The meals are fresh, responsibly sourced, and made with high quality ingredients, no junk. Honestly, it tastes like it's chef-made because it is chef-made. Cook Unity has over 300 meals to choose from, so whether you're vegan, gluten-free, paleo, keto, pescatarian like me, there's something for everyone. No meal prep, no dishes, and it's cheaper than groceries. Right now, Cook Unity is offering my viewers 50% off of your first order. Just click the link in the description below and use my code Everest50 to try it out for yourself. Now let's get back to that amazing story. Okay, let's now set up this theoretical team, the super team, to go and find the remains of Sandy Irvine and any other artifacts that might be on the Central Rongbuk Glacier, and also look into what we would need to bring with us to ensure the most successful outcome if something were found. First and foremost, in order to do that, you would need permission from the Chinese Tibetan Mountaineering Authority. Without their permission, nobody is getting even 1 meter into the Central Rongbuk. Most of the teams that climb on Mount Everest use the same route that was used by the British in 1924, which is the East Rongbuk Glacier. I described that in a little bit more detail in that video about National Geographic and what they're not telling us. Okay, let's say theoretically, now you have permission from the CTMA. Now you want to go do the search. And this is a very, very long glacier. So the most important thing would be to narrow down to a few specific areas where to at least begin the search. And therein, I turn to Bob Edwards. And in his studies, Bob talked about several scenarios of Irvine landing down on the glacier. Let me cut away to a short part of my interview with Bob Edwards to discuss the possible scenarios of where that boot might have been discovered in 2024. So Bob, you wrote this amazing book on the mystery of Mallory and Irvine and came up with many angles from which to view the mystery. And then October 2024 rolls around and a whole dynamic changed with the discovery of Sandy Irvine's boot and his foot. One of the first questions you asked was, where did they find that boot? And obviously saying that it made a lot of sense that National Geographic did not want to say precisely where it was. But of course, the thinking minds immediately start doing all sorts of math and trying to figure out right where it was. So I'd love you to unpack that a little bit.
I think you know, and it has already been discussed on internet forums that there are at least two clues to the location. Firstly, there's the picture of Jimmy Chin, the leader of the team, squatting with the boot in front of him, looking towards the camera, and behind him you see blue sky. You see that he is in a kind of corridor with ice walls. Behind him, there's open blue sky with no trace of a mountain. And people who know that area can make an informed conjecture about where it is. And I have reached out to such people, and they have kindly shared their thoughts about where that location is. And the second clue, which again I think you know about, you've seen it on the forums, is that in Jimmy Chin's sunglasses there is a reflection, and in that reflection you see, I think, 3 or 4 members of his team. Obviously, one of them is the photographer, who seems to be kneeling down, and there are 3 people standing. And behind them, you can see the reverse of the canyon within which they are standing or kneeling. And in the far distance, or maybe the medium distance, you can see some mountains, or at least you can see some terrain. And there are imaging applications on the internet, which are in the public domain, such as Peak Finder and Peak Visor. And you can take any point you like on Earth, look in a direction of your choice, and it will give you a panorama of the landscape that you see. And this I have done. I've used primarily Peak Visor, and I came to a view as to what those ridges or mountains were in the reflected image. And between the first and the second clue, I had a working assumption or hypothesis about where the place was, which I have published on my articles.
Incredible. So you essentially, by determining where that was, you look at the length and the breadth of the Central Rongbuk Glacier. And if you identify that, you can, it would be general, but at least relative in terms of understanding at the speed of the glacier moving at said rate over the last potentially 100 years, you could probably come to some, I'm going to say guesstimation, but somewhat accurate, I would imagine, idea of when Sandy Irvine came to rest in the actual Central Rongbuk Glacier. Correct?
Yes, Tom, that's correct. That was the next stage of my analysis. And just to give you the context of that, since I've already published this estimate, what I have written on Goodreads and Medium is that, first of all, and here I acknowledge the kindness of Everest veterans who have shared with me their view that the location is on the central moraine of the glacier. That's to say, the central moraine and not the lateral moraines. Now, the central moraine, you can see it on Google Earth. It's a strip, a corridor, or if you like, a canyon of primarily stone, which is very distinctive. You can see it very clearly, distinctively from the ice mass of the glacier, and it runs pretty much in the center of the glacier. It starts in recent images, let's just say around 2017, at about 4.5 kilometers from the head of the glacier, and seems to continue nearly all the way down to, I think, what is called the snout of the glacier, or the place where the glacier terminates, which is about 11 kilometers from the head. So that was my first, if you like, point of narrowing down the central moraine. Backing up a little bit, using Peak Visor, I tried many, many places on the central moraine, working north to south. And the one which seemed to match that reflected image the best was about 6.5 kilometers from the head of the glacier. So here I'm thinking, well, Irvine's boot, let's leave aside his body for the moment, but his boot has traveled, by my estimate, and obviously I'm open to be corrected on this because I'm just a mathematician. I have only the data which are already in the public domain. I'm not a mountaineer, but I'm starting with 6.5 kilometers from the head of the glacier. And as you say, the question now is, what period of time would be necessary for Irvine's remains to travel from the head of the glacier to that point? 6.5 kilometers. And clearly, the only way I could think of to approach this was to look at data on the speed of the glacier. And literally, I started this exercise knowing nothing about glaciers.
In the interview with Bob, he goes on to unpack the estimated speed that the glacier has traveled over the last 100 years up to the discovery of the boot. And what he does is he narrows it down to a couple points in time that Sandy might have come to rest at the head of the Rongbuk Glacier. Suffice it to say, his calculations would be vitally important in forming a comprehensive search plan on the Central Rongbuk Glacier. The full interview of my interview with Bob Edwards will be on my podcast, The Happiness Quotient, and the link will be provided in the description of this video. So after Jamie McGinnis really helped uncover a direct line to the idea that Sandy Irvine had been removed from or committed to the mountain well before 2008, Mark Sinnott and I had a conversation that discussed the idea of going up the Central Rongbuk Glacier to do an intense study and search of that area. Time ran out. And of course, funding, which is the big issue, because if you're going to do a legitimate and thorough search of the Central Rongbuk Glacier, even with the clue, even if GPS coordinates of the boot were provided, that would be a substantial investment. This is exactly how I'd do it if I was in charge of a future search of the Central Rongbuk to look for the rest of the remains of Sandy Irvine. First, I would probably start in the post-monsoon season, which would be September or October. There's a period of time there where the weather is very stable and relatively dry. It would be a good opportunity to do an initial search, to do the main search in the following spring if nothing turned up or if the search provided inconclusive results. Let's talk about the team that we would need to assemble. Certainly a glaciologist would be an important addition, somebody there who's able to interpret ice movement, a lateral moraine or a central moraine, and how the ice moves a little bit more quickly in certain areas of the glacier than others. And also this person could interpret previous years of data that have been collected about the Central Rongbuk Glacier. I would also have with us a forensic pathologist. This person would be there to examine any remains that were found, preserving the evidence and identifying possibility of trauma. Now, granted, the condition of the remains might be mostly skeletal, so it's hard to say if much could be determined from it, but I think that would be something that if you wanted to cross all your T's and dot your I's along the way, that a forensic pathologist would be an important addition. And also, in addition to that, to have a mountaineering historian who understands all the expeditions that took place going back into the 1920s to examine oxygen bottles or different types of fabric that might be found, whether there was a tent or a tent pole. And also in the years after the 1924 expedition, there might be other human remains in there, including the remains of Marco Siffredi, the French snowboarder who fell from the North Face, Marty Hoey, the American woman who passed away and fell down the North Face in the late 1980s. These are all things that could theoretically turn up, and those are just two of many who theoretically could be found in the Central Rongbuk, and you would want to be prepared to do the right thing if that happened. Of course, you'd want a filmmaker, cameraman, sound man, everybody there, a photographer to capture it perfectly. And of course, you'd want the proper support team to go with it, where there might be experienced Sherpas and logistic experts to ensure the safety of all the team members, whether there's crevasses on the glacier or holes that one could fall into. Sometimes there are tunnels and rocks that could fall from the lateral or central moraines. And also, on top of all those very important team members would be possibly the key to being able to cover vast distances up and down and across the glacier. And that would be drones. And with that drone, not only would you make visual observances, but you would include with that LiDAR. That is light detection and ranging. It's a mechanical device that sends out a beam of light that bounces off every single object that it reaches, and LiDAR can actually penetrate a certain amount beneath the surface of the ice or snow, and it would detect any anomalies. So if there were human remains or an oxygen canister, it would be much easier to understand if you were onto something. And as it's explained, that bouncing light from the LiDAR is recorded back at the original device, so you get a measurement of the distance to everything that the light hits. So you might find the fabric of a tent or a boot or an ice axe or an ice screw or something like that. An analogy for LiDAR would be sonar that's used underwater by submarines, and you can imagine the sonar pulsing out radio waves, and when it bounces off something, it's fed back to the source of those waves, and it creates essentially an image of what it is that is in front of it or within the range of those waves. So I think that LiDAR would be vital, and this would allow people to cover much greater distances. For instance, in 2019, our team had drones, and we did vast explorations of the North Face on high-resolution video and photography, so we could take ourselves out of the equation in terms of the danger and the risk that we'd be exposed to. Since 2019, the advancement of drones has exponentially grown, and it's incredible how far it's come. So there's no doubt in my mind that in 2025, 2026 and beyond, that a drone with a LiDAR affixed to it could do amazing things and cover vast distances, sparing that team the boots on the ground, time and risk that it would entail normally. After the use of that LiDAR, I think it would be important to use what's called a GPR, or ground penetrating radar. And so this is where you would take boots on the ground and go back over areas that suggested the possibility of human remains or artifacts of curiosity for the search team. And you can see in this video that this graphic explains how the GPR, the ground penetrating radar, penetrates down into the ground, in this case to look for pipes or cables that are deep under the ground. But you can see that this might be a great way to go deeper into the ice, because this ground penetrating radar would go deeper. Now, these drones would be really, really important to have there, just primarily for great visuals for the documentary that certainly should be produced with it. And there are companies that are already using these drones that show collision resistant drones that they fly down into tunnels in the glacier, which a human being shouldn't do because there might be running water. It would be very, very dangerous and risky to send a person down there. So these drones can fly down, literally bump into the ceiling of ice or a wall without being cut off, and go into deep, small crawl spaces, and at the same time map exactly what's in there visually and through LiDAR and GPR. Certainly this wouldn't be your typical climbing team, not a climbing team at all for that matter. It would be a precision scientific and archaeological operation, and a very important one at that, because the remains of Sandy Irvine are cherished by family of Sandy Irvine, who are anxiously awaiting the possibility that the rest of his remains could be found. So everybody will be watching, and hopefully, if it happens this fall or next year, there would be some great success and could bring closure to the Irvine family. We would not just be searching for human remains, but obviously on the forefront of our minds, or my mind, would be the very distinct possibility that the coveted camera, the Kodak VESTPOCKET camera, would be with Sandy Irvine. And if that happened, of course, we would take every precaution to be sure that that camera was treated with the utmost care so as not to damage it if that film had not been exposed to light previously. I did a video, would it be possible to develop the film if it were found and if it were not damaged in the 100 years plus that it had been lost? And in this video, I'll put a link to it. Yes, it is. Experts from Kodak Film have said absolutely it would be possible to recover that film. So that would be a whole other element of the search that you'd want to keep your eye on. Tom Holzell, the Everest historian, suggested that that film should be shuttled immediately to experts in some photography laboratories in certain areas of the world that would be able to develop it with the greatest care. Kodak did confirm back in the 90s, before we went on the 99 expedition, that film could be developed if it was kept frozen as well. So possibly you'd need to have dry ice with you, and so that would help you keep the camera cold, and then you'd want to keep it in a dark space. And now, why would that camera be important? Well, if you find the remains of Sandy Irvine, it very likely would offer no clues as to whether Mallory and Irvine made it to the summit or not. As Julie Summers said in my interview with her, the Irvine family had speculated that the only thing that's going to say whether they made it to the summit or not would be if there was a note in Sandy's pocket that said, "We did it" or "We didn't do it." And we know that isn't a likely scenario. So this camera really holds such great possibilities in it. And then, of course, all the contents of the pockets of Sandy Irvine, if he's found. Would there be any other artifacts that possibly were collected on the mountain? As you know, I did a couple of videos with Pete Poston talking about the rocks that were in George Mallory's boots, this boot that is at the Royal Geographical Society in London. So all these things would need to be taken into consideration to make sure that this site was protected and all possibilities and great care was taken to preserve it and make sure that nothing was damaged. Absolutely, the time is ripe to go back up the Central Rongbuk Glacier. And so let me ask you, what do you think? Be sure to leave a comment in the section below. I read all the comments and would love to know your thoughts and what you feel might be found, and if I've forgotten any team members or other technological ways to do a more thorough search of the Central Rongbuk. And should there be a search outside of that area at the same time, other people to look in areas that perhaps we hadn't identified yet? And I hope if you've enjoyed this video that you'll take a moment to subscribe if you haven't done so already, and absolutely check out my exclusive content in the members section, or there's a free members section over on Patreon at patreon.com/Everest Mystery. There's a lot to explore there and many great mysteries that we unfold and some incredible stories. So be sure to subscribe and hit the bell icon. We might be standing at the edge of a great breakthrough in the mystery of Mallory and Irvine. Stay curious, stay humble, and stay tuned. do a good deed, don't ask for anything in return, make the world a better place, one tiny step at a time. Peace be with you.